a couple of things that I've struggled with and been able to somewhat deal with over the past year has been um, letting go of this career identity that I've had for such a long time. Is it's, you know, ever since undergrad, it was like, okay, I'm going to be in oil and gas. I want to be a project manager. And then I went, oh, screw that. I'm going to go to NYU, become something in finance or procurement or blah, blah, blah. And it was always nice, I think, for me to be able to explain to people what I'm doing in a way that's quite easy to grasp and understand, but that way always made me feel empty. Now what I'm doing is I don't like I share it with you and I share it with a small group of other people that, I'm writing a lot. I'm hopefully going to publish something at some point in the relatively near future. I'm, working through my belief system and stuff like that. But that isn't as impressive as what I thought I ought to be doing. And letting go of that and kind of running full speed ahead into this new identity or this new pursuit has been wonderful. And I've met really interesting people through this new pursuit. I've been able to go to really cool places, have some nice experiences. And 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 that's one thing. It's like I said, you asked me a really difficult question, and I'm trying to work my way through it right now out loud. But letting go of letting go of these expectations that I had put on myself for years, in order to create space for what I'm actually passionate about has been very freeing. And then again, like I said, trying to learn how to fail and using failure as a bit of a signal for the fact that I'm pursuing something worthwhile has been a good lesson as well. So I'm not too sure if that answers your question well, but that's an attempt at least.
Yeah, no, the question was actually pretty straightforward. It's just what do you feel like you've learned so far, right? Or kind of where are you at with this? And so, sure, so it's kind of the shedding of the old skin. Um, Another one of my former students in a previous podcast episode, she's actually in some ways going through something similar as you. So she kind of just left her old path completely, actually, and it's
Mhm.
just taking time off without having a very obvious, clear next step, right? And really kind of focusing on the self awareness, the self improvement, all this kind of stuff. Um, and so of course this is the a little bit of the uncertain phase because you're shedding the old, but you're not clear on the new yet, right? And so that's
Yeah,
scary, uncomfortable. And as you just alluded to, there's really nothing in our educational system that prepares you for. If anything, it tells you not to do this, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
um, so unfortunately, that makes what's otherwise a very necessary life transition, I think, for many people. It makes it a lot harder than it probably needs to be honest, right? So,
I I think that's 100% true, and it depends on I assume it depends on where you go to school, but as far as I'm concerned, like my entire experience throughout, like from elementary school all the way up until, you and I met, it's been you cannot fail because it will blemish some sort of a record, and you need as pristine as possible of a record as humanly as you can muster in order to make it to the next step. And I think that growing up throughout the education system and doing everything I could in my power to not fail, it's been a really wild transition to now chasing those failures, and trying to convince myself that it's the right thing to do. Because even from like a very practical standpoint, it's so I've been essentially off work for a year, and I think about this every once in a while, whereas it's like if I want to get back into like the post business school game, I'm gonna have to tell a pretty convincing story to someone, to a recruiter, as far as it's like, what is this gap in your resume and what does it mean? Because I feel like just saying taking some time in order to figure out myself, my belief system, and pursue something that's more creative is not exactly a great answer if you're trying to become a director of business development for a construction company.
um, so I think in many contexts that's true. Um, but Davis, I suspect you've been noticing there are some massive shifts happening at the moment as we
Yeah.
speak. So, there was a really on my feed, there's that podcast Diary of a CEO,
Yeah.
right? So there's this video that keeps popping up on my feed that I wasn't clicking on for like a week and a half, and then I finally caved and clicked on it because it clearly just, pushed it on me. And it was this guy who was basically talking about how 99% of jobs are going to be eliminated. Now, I think he's exaggerating, or we can say he's exaggerating in the sense that his time frame, it's not going to be like in the next 5 years, right, or something like this. Um, but it is definitely true. I mean, it is so dramatic that even at the school level, because schools tend to be extremely not innovative or responsive to what's happening out in the real world. Now we're starting to have chats about, well, what should we do about AI, right? And I already know how these meetings are going to go. Nobody has any idea what the answer is actually, right? Partly
Yeah.
because nobody even knows what jobs are going to be there that a school could feed into naturally, right? With the pre-existing model that we have, right? Like we have no idea what that actually looks like. So, but that stuff does seem like it's coming. I mean, actually, we can debate about that. It depends on the day. Sometimes when I use ChatGPT, I feel like that's just massively hyped, and this thing is not going to threaten hardly anyone's job because it's terribly incompetent.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are other days where I'm like, wow, okay, I can definitely see that these jobs might disappear. So I'm really 50-50 about kind of how much of this is just hype and overhyped, and it's not coming for a long time, versus actually, no, this is like for real, and we really need to think about this in a much more serious way. All that being said, so what does this relate to in terms of your situation? If you do decide to come back, I'm not sure the world is even going to look the same. And my suspicion is that what's actually going to be happening is instead of most people banking on, I work for this employer and expect this level of stability and this kind of paycheck, I think we're going to see a bunch of people essentially get pushed into entrepreneurship, right? Because that option just doesn't look as appealing, and therefore they need to go out on their own and figure out how they're going to build a business of a certain size, right?
Yeah.
For them. Um, I also think that what's happening right now, there's a huge, massive kind of black hole with the whole meaning thing, exactly what you're going through. Because the number of people on this planet who haven't in their education figured out at all, like anything about meaning, the moment the AI disruption, or actually it doesn't even have to be AI, it could just be a recession, right? Or something else that comes. Kind of like what happened during COVID with the Great Resignation, we'll get another wave of that. And I think sooner rather than later. But again, we're going to have a bunch of people who are just upset and lost, right? And so there'll be huge demand for how to solve that.
Well, okay, so this is maybe a better answer to your question of what have I learned, but it's specifically about this meaning and fulfillment, which is I check in with myself every once in a while, and actually not every once in a while, almost daily, where I remember before, kind of my life went through this abrupt change. I remember sitting in my office slash my cubicle, depending on what job I'm talking about. And it's like, looking at my watch and it's 1:45 p.m. And I would have given anything for it to be 5:30. And I felt that way, I don't know, maybe not daily, but let's say 3 out of the 5 weekdays, I was just going like, oh my God, I cannot wait for it to be tomorrow because tomorrow is one day closer to the weekend. And I honestly, like, I've had some weird days. I've had some lonely days. I've had some bored days. I've had some days where I'm just sitting around doom scrolling or reading the same page of a book 10 times because my mind's wandering. But these days, I do not sit here and go, I would trade anything in order for this day to be shorter or in order to get to tomorrow. Because I realized that it was like I spent 3 years post graduating from NYU with about half the days just going like I would trade this I would trade this for anything else. And I've learned over the past year that it's like as long as I can maintain me being in this exact day, and I'm relatively purposeful or mindful about the fact that, time isn't necessarily running out. Like, I'm not trying to be morbid about this, but it's like if I can minimize the amount of days that I would trade for just honestly to be one day closer to death so that I don't have to do this bullshit anymore. That's like, I don't think that's a meaningless pursuit in life, is to try to maximize the amount of days where you just want to kind of sit there and do whatever. Um, I've I said earlier when you asked me what I'm writing about that I'm trying to work through my belief system and stuff like that. And I've said this to you before, and I'm going to say it again. I think it's really difficult to define your own belief system without taking from, existing dogma or existing religions. Or it's really easy for me to tell you what I've heard other people say they believe in and espouse them as my own views, but to actually define my own belief system is quite tricky. And you've asked me about this multiple times. Almost every single time we talk, we have this conversation. And so for a while, I was sitting there trying to define my belief system and trying to figure out, okay, exactly, like, what do I believe? What is the meaning of life? And I went, maybe that's too big of a question. So it's like, okay, so how do I feel about heaven? How do I feel about hell? And what I've come down to is the closest, or the definition of hell that I've come up with that resonates the most with myself is that hell isn't a place. You don't have to wait to die in order to get there. No one wearing a robe and a beard hurling thunderbolts is going to send you there. For me, at least, hell is as simple as the distance between who you are and who you want to be. It's just like that one moment that's stretched between what is and what could be if you just tried. And as far as I'm concerned, post MBA, when I was in corporate America, that distance was stretching wider and wider and wider. And my life felt like it was just going to be an eternity of me screwing caps onto bottles. And since leaving that, I've been really trying to bring those two things together. And not through being impressive, not through working on my CV, but just through trying to choose, okay, so what is the perfect day? Will I ever get there? Probably not, but I can get a hell of a lot closer to that perfect day. Um, if I'm mindful about it and I actually try, than just going and promising myself that, oh, with the next bonus round and the next promotion, I'll be incrementally happier. So maybe that's a better answer to the question of what I'm writing about and what I've learned over the past little while. But that's it. That's what I think of when I think of meaning and fulfillment. Is it's just like, okay, if hell is that distance, do whatever you can in order to bring those two things closer together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in values wise, I mean, we obviously match quite well on this, right? I mean, I definitely advocate for that. This really comes down to, in part, what you think this is all about, right? Like when everyone's born, there's you, right? And then there's the world. And so is the world and life supposed to turn out in such a way that those two things align really well or not, right? And so I think you and I are in the camp that, well, they probably should, right? Because the idea that you somehow have to live this life, as you'd refer to it, as this huge distance between yourself and the life you have to live, it sounds like torture, right? I mean, particularly taken to the extreme, right? And this is exactly what one would think of as a definition of torture, or in your case, you define it as hell. I would agree. So if that's not the point of life, right, having that experience, then surely it must be something about closing that gap. And it just to state the obvious, to your point earlier, it's interesting that that observation, at least I don't remember it in any of my schooling, anyone ever saying this.
No, but and then that gets us back to failure and what the schooling system is, and I think it's useful and I've learned a lot. I've met wonderful, I mean, you and I wouldn't have met if it wasn't for higher education. So, but it really does feel like a factory model, whereas it's like, okay, so we eschew failure. We essentially drill into students' heads that, you cannot fail, which is super handy if you're working in a factory where quality assurance and quality control is paramount and you have Lean Six Sigma error management and stuff like that. Whereas it's like, okay, failure when you're trying to produce a Ford F-150 is important because you don't want a bunch of cars go or trucks going out of the lot or out of the factory that break apart and don't work. But the problem is in more creative pursuits or anything to do with meaning, I think that failure is an integral part, which is why we have, which is why Rocky is so meaningful, the movie, or we have all these sports movies and I think that that's probably why sports matter so much is it's because you watch other people fail. And I think you can either internalize it and go like, oh, look at that loser. He failed. Or you can watch it and go, oh, no, it's actually okay to fail. Because if you're not failing, what are you actually trying to accomplish here?
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. It's interesting. So I like that contrast that you just drew. A lot of jobs, right? Historically, this has certainly been true in human history, but still largely true, are a little bit more like the factory, right? In other words, you get up, you kind of do the same thing. This is exactly the stuff that we're now terrified that AI, and if you combine that with robots as
Yeah.
they get better,
Yeah.
are going to just do much better, right, than humans. I mean, if you want error free in a factory, how could you possibly think that a group of humans is going to beat a group of robots combined with a great AI, right? It's just not going to happen. So,
Right.
so we all can kind of see that, and I don't think anyone would dispute that. And that used to be for the literal factories we worried about that, and now it's for the white collar jobs, right? That's what AI is essentially doing right now, presumably, right? Even though we're still waiting on the real numbers to come out on that. And so what does that leave for humans then, right? And I think it leaves creativity is a huge one, right?
Hmm.
I mean, and this is something that we didn't teach at all, right? When I look back and think about, what were the exercises that we were given, or I was given at least,
Yeah.
to build that muscle? Basically nothing, right?
Yeah.
Almost nothing. And I think that's basically where we're at with education, which is a terrible kind of consequence because we now have a bunch of people who even we might have called good students, but in this real narrow definition, right? I'll even include myself in this. But now thrown this challenge, we are completely unprepared. And the idea of being good was always equated to being better prepared. But once you're out of the factory, you're not prepared at all, right?
Yeah.
There is no sort of appropriate environment where this is where we're very well adapted to that. And I think people have this sort of surface level paranoia about, hey, will AI take my job? The underlying phenomena or the sense, though, is that, well, it's because we all got trained to build these muscles that actually AI is just, and robots are going to do a way better job of doing than us. And so, and we don't have other muscles. I think this is the other that have been developed, right? Like I don't think that that's broadly the case, and that's a little bit terrifying when we sort of think about, well, what does that mean when you scale that up to millions, if not billions, of human beings right on the planet?
But the scary thing too is just the way that the question is posed is like, will AI take my job? Is it's in so many cultures that actually means will AI take my identity? And we're not looking at this from a standpoint of it's like, well, what can I gain with that free time? How can I leverage AI or how is AI going to come into the workforce and give me more space to explore something else? And but instead it's like, what is it going to take away from me? And I think that that's a really terrifying place to be because it is somewhat of what I've gone through over the past year, which is, I mean, AI didn't take my job. I effectively like fired myself, but trying to figure out, it's like, okay, what am I going to do with that dead space? Like, how am I going to fill 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 hours per week of now free intellectual space in a way that I've never had to fill it before because I always had something to do. I always had a deadline. I always had an email to answer. I always had something else going on. And it's like, yeah, okay, so AI may or may not be coming for your job, but it's like if you strip that job away, what then becomes the largest part of your identity?
Yeah, I completely agree. But that I think, and I probably should have articulated this more clearly earlier. That's what I really meant to say, is that that is the giant chasm of a problem, as well as the opportunity that I just don't see even the very best kind of cutting edge people in that space being able to just mitigate that problem and make it not a problem. Like that problem is actually coming, it's coming relatively fast. And I think we are terribly unprepared for that. So if we think about a lot of standard career coaching, a lot of it is implicitly designed for, hey, I don't like my job as a chemist. What I'd really love to do is be a camp counselor. It's like, all right, let's help you get there, right? With a little
Yeah.
bit of helping you figure that out. But it's from well-defined point A to pretty well-defined point B, if not equally well-defined, right? It's just about changing that to line you up better. That's the traditional model. Let's call it that. The new model can't be that because a lot of those things probably aren't going to even be there, the point Bs. And so it's about, all right, well, point A, either by force or by your own reckoning, it didn't happen or it's not going to work. And so we need to discover what the point B is, and you might have to create it. And very likely you're going to have to create it. Right.
Yeah.
And that's a different type of exercise than just a defined point B to get you there. And I think that's where we're really not well prepared for this because it's all about introspection and then it's about risk management. It's about having emotional support as you take that journey because we know that in the educational system we grew up with and the families we all were generally raised in, most of us on the spectrum are probably risk averse because we were trained to be that way.
Yeah.
And this is totally inappropriate for that type of exercise, which a lot of people may not have a choice but to start thinking about, right? And so
Hmm.
rather than making that a terrible traumatic experience, which a lot of times when we think about job displacements, they are, right? They
Yeah.
just are. I mean, before it's an old story now, right? But like the Midwestern
Yeah.
factory worker getting laid off from the auto plant and the
Yeah.
town dying, like how many of them went off to find that great big blue sky? Like not a lot of them, right? We didn't, but that's partly because they were terribly unprepared by the society and the world for those transitions. And now it's going to hit white collar folks, but now we're also going to see it at a much bigger scale, right? And I see that.
So, uh, listen, so you know this. Before I moved to New York, I lived in Calgary and I worked in oil and gas. And it's when I started was right before the oil crash, and I effectively saw like the entire city or the entire province of Alberta change almost overnight. And then you see a bunch of protests, and it's a bunch of people that are protesting. They're pro pipeline. They want more and more pipelines. And I look at it and it's like. I don't necessarily think that, a welder or a torquer or an engineer, I don't think anyone is that passionate, or not anyone, but most people are not that passionate about pipelines. They're not asking for more pipelines. They're asking for relevance. And that I think is the terrifying, maybe not terrifying, maybe freeing. It all depends on your perspective, but that's this transition that you were alluding to in the Midwest with the factory worker that I experienced when I was working in oil and gas, is it's going, okay, so there's the old guard, there's new guard, and we're in this transition period. But during that transition period, when you're upskilling or when you're retraining yourself or anything like that, you feel like you lose relevance, and I mean, fuck me, like the last year is has been I lost my relevance when I quit my job. I moved back to Canada and I've been trying to like figure out what that actually means for me. And it's been a tricky and every once in a while a bit dicey learning experience. But at the end of the day, I think that a lot of what we're looking for here is relevance. And every once in a while, when I'm on LinkedIn and I'm looking at positions that I could apply to, it's getting that job title again is some sort of a proxy for like a quote unquote synthetic relevance that I could at least pat myself on the back about for a month or two until I've worked my fifth Saturday in a row and I go, screw this relevance. I want to go back to upskilling and retraining.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's framed in a really positive way, right? So when I was writing my book and I was trying to think about like, okay, how is this fitting in with changes that I'm seeing, right, in society? And one of it was that, maybe hundreds of years ago, people didn't have the luxury to think about things like meaning and purpose because they were just trying to survive, literally,
Yeah,
right, on the
yeah.
most basic needs. So, that wasn't going to be the right time or the place to talk about this. But these days, we're seeing a lot of concerns about this at a level that I don't think we've ever seen before. at scale, right? Globally. And people asking lots of questions around it. And this is a really good thing as long as these people solve it, right? But now what's happening is we've got this external shock, right? Because we might have thought that the equilibrium might be, well, okay, for most people, if you don't get to it, if you don't solve it, you're going to survive at least, right? You're going to keep that job for the next 30 years. And, you may not love it, but maybe you'll find some way to get by. And hey, that might be just how your life goes. But now I feel like what's happening is if the AI revolution really does have these effects that people are talking about and robots get better, which, that's coming too, we're going to see a lot of forced involuntary displacement, basically, right? Um, which is going to push a bunch of people who they might have been too scared or not actually wanted to be displaced, right? And now in the situation of where you're at right now, basically, right? And that's without the infrastructure to help. And there's no sign that I'm seeing at all that there's any infrastructure being built for that right now. It's going to be a scary societal shift, right, in this way. But if we do it successfully, it's actually going to work out real well. Like 100 years later, people are going to talk about in the history books, the old days when people worked these jobs that they were miserable in. And then people in that time will be like, why did people do that? Right. The way that we look at people in probably the 1800s, and we're like, whoa, that was pretty miserable. Right. So that would be the happy ending version of this. But it really depends, I think, on how this transition goes. Right. When you have a lot of people who are lost in the collective, which I think is happening increasingly anyway. And this ties to things like the collapse and dysfunction of institutions. Right. If you sort of watch what's going on with that, institutions are
Yep.
definitely kind of going through their collapse. So the things that people thought that they could rely on and bank on as credible and reliable and trustworthy throughout their lives, increasingly we're starting to see kind of lots of questions. So, Davis, I don't know if you're in a shed up in BC, so maybe you're not observing it, but I'm observing more and more now. I think everybody that I know around me has at least one conspiracy theory that they believe in now. And many of these were people that would never have believed a single conspiracy theory before, but
Yep.
all it took was, the Epstein stuff getting covered up, right?
Yep.
Government starting to say one thing and then say another thing later, right? And a bunch of things that start to cause people to question things. And then mainstream media trust in that is probably at an all-time low, I suspect.
Yeah.
So now everybody seems to have their own take on what's happening.
Absolutely. I would argue that probably a shed in BC is one of the best places to get into conspiracy theories. But yeah, no, I mean, I feel you. I spent quite a bit of time this summer in Alberta, just kind of driving around and seeing old friends and stuff like that. And Alberta is, I mean, there's a separatist movement going. I don't know if it's a movement or if it's just a vein that's going through Alberta right now, which I think is unfortunate. But they're like, yeah, conspiracy theories are well and alive up here. So, but it's hard not to go. I can't trust all the information, and I think people come like the anti-vaccine movement, I think, is terrifying. I don't know enough about it in order to have a very strong opinion. I've always just trusted the Canadian and or the United States medical advice that I've received, but I see a lot of people going, life doesn't make sense right now, and these very niche kind of out there, and it's not necessarily right-wing conspiracy theories, but these niche talking heads. Some of the shit that they're saying makes a hell of a lot more sense than what I'm seeing on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or anything like that. So yeah, I get it, and I've got a stack of conspiracy theories that I'm working my way through right now that I don't necessarily think are insane as some of the things that I'm seeing going on around us.
Yeah. Yeah, this is an interesting time because I think traditionally conspiracy theories were sort of very fringe, or maybe you had a friend that believed a few of them, and everyone was like, yeah, okay, whatever. But these days, conspiracy theories seem to be becoming more mainstream, as time goes by in the sort of collective belief. Not that everybody's believing the same things, which I think is actually part of the problem. We don't know what's true, and so people are kind of making up theories to try to fit the evidence in their own mind to make sense of the world. And then you've got basically, to go back to what we talked about earlier, what's going to be large displacements. So you've got a crisis of meaning, you've got collapse of institutions, you've got, I mean, it really is kind of the fodder for something like a revolution, right? If you think about what caused revolutions in the past, right? Not to make any specific predictions about any country or anything, but the foundations of revolution usually are this kind of clear, unsustainable lack of confidence, right? All these things,
Hmm.
um, and no hope that the current system is going to really kind of fix itself, right? And so we do seem to have an awful lot of these elements, not just in one country, but in multiple countries at the same time. So,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've done quite a bit of traveling over the last year, and to be perfectly honest, it doesn't matter where I meet people, the conversations are all quite similar.
yeah, yeah, I suspect that is also the case. So it is an interesting time to be going through a journey like yours, right? And to be in that phase, Davis, you know, 5+ years later, what you might find is what you're going through right now, you were just early compared to what large masses of people are struggling with. And there may be certain advantages to that, right? If you're the
I
guy who went through it.
I honestly I hope so. And a lot of what I'm trying to pursue right now, like through writing and telling stories and stuff like that, is there's a lot of indigenous wisdom, especially like from the Pacific Northwest, is there's pipe carriers and there's medicine men and women and there are elders. And they use various different substances and psychedelics and stuff like that in order to have visions, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not well versed in this, so I'm gonna try to simplify this as much as possible. But something that a few people have now, like throughout my journey, have taught me is that if you've been given the opportunity to go on these explorations, be it physical traveling explorations and or you've just been given the time, um, and sometimes the substances to do like the really deep inner work, uh your job or at least your mission needs to be to learn something and then to bring it back to the community. And a lot of me trying to write is at this point like a very new attempt in order to go through my own struggles, learn my own lessons, but then be able to bring them back and share them so that, and it's like if I share them with 10 people, because I send my writing to a few of my friends, if I share them with 10 people and two people or even one person goes, oh, this one line meant something to me, or I needed to see this today. I'm like, okay, fuck it. Like that's my job is done for today. And then I get to try to do that tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And I I hope, because it's been a very beautiful experience this past year for me. I hope more people get to go through something maybe a little bit more on their own terms, and maybe it's a little bit less janky and duct taped together. But at the end of the day, I am very grateful for this, and I do feel like as corporate North America, let's say, but honestly, like the global workforce starts to change and starts to become more, I I hate this word, but more synergistic with robots and machines and artificial intelligence. I think that it's going to free up a lot of people in order to ask some questions that are important to ask in order to live somewhat of a fulfilled life. Um, and if I can share one thing with two people, then okay, that's two that's two checks as far as I'm concerned next to my name.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I have similar feelings. I What's really interesting about this, because I've been thinking about this problem on and off for a while. Obviously, I wrote a book about it and then I kind of came back to it here and there, but it's not a one size fits all answer, interestingly enough. So, in other words,
Right.
the basic need is the same that all humans have, right? But how they go from point A to point B, if you will, is actually going to be dramatically different and then who they will trust as a guide or as a community to help them through that, also dramatically different, right? You can't expect that everyone is going to resonate with one guide, right, or one community for that to
Hmm.
kind of work. So it is clearly going to be a multifaceted kind of solution, even if the fundamental structure that everybody goes through is the same, right? Even if that were actually true. And so the interesting question there then is what version of that, if we were going to try to build a business, right? So let's think about this like entrepreneurs, because we just said that AI is going to wipe away a ton of jobs and we're having this crisis of meaning. If you're an entrepreneur, you would look at that and say, okay, I'm going to build a business then to help people solve this problem, right? And
Hmm.
actually find something, at the end. Um, Unlike a lot of other types of education, if you will, where it's more like here's external knowledge. I'm just going to keep feeding it to you, and I'm going to test you how well you like know it. Um, and it's on you, right? I mean, this is flipped the other way. This is okay. We're going to look inside you. I'm going to help be your guide, and our success metric is whether you feel like that we've actually made good progress, which is quite scary, right? If you go from external knowledge and testing to like, actually, here's a process that we just got to trust that this is going to work almost all the time, right? And so I think that's an interesting question. Like whether it's, you're up in the Pacific Northwest, whether it's about retreats, right? Where you do, I don't know what you guys do up there. I'm going to make up something. Sweat lodges. Maybe you guys do sweat lodges up there, right? I've heard that that
Hmm.
happens.
Hmm.
Um, and so that plus, other types of things that mix maybe even the spiritual with that. I mean, that's going to work for a certain type of group. And the demand will absolutely be there for that, right? And then for other people, that won't work and it'll have to be a different way. But the fundamental structure for all those things is actually probably going to be very, very similar, I suspect. So we'll see a lot of people kind of getting into that space more than we see now. Because I think that as many people as there are that might call themselves life or career coaches these days, I don't think that there's nearly enough for the demand that's coming, right? That's going to come from these displacements.
I I completely, yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And so yes, you're correct. We do sweat lodges up here, not right now because there's a fire ban, but it's going to be lifted by the end of September, and so I'll be going up north in order to do a couple at the beginning of October. But and then you have various other things. There's ayahuasca, and then I mean, there are sun dances, which is essentially just an extreme form of a sweat lodge, but they're very hard to access, as they absolutely should be, because they're like an extremely sacred part of the indigenous culture and wisdom that is, I think, starting to become a little bit more accessible to guys like me. But but yeah, so we absolutely have those things. Now, it's so funny. I always toy with what kind of, because I've done quite a bit of wellness experimentation, let's say, over the past year. And to be perfectly honest, it's like I left my job in order to go to Austin, and you know this, and I did ketamine therapy with like a wonderful doctor down in Austin, and I have this team that I keep in touch with down there that they check in on me every once in a while. I check in on them every once in a while. And to be perfectly honest, I tell some of my friends that I graduated with who are going through their own lives right now about the experience, and there's a jealousy that it's, and not a mean jealousy, but it's like they're like, oh God, what I wouldn't do to have 2 weeks where I could just disappear and go and do some internal work and stuff like that. And I think that creating accessible, to creating spaces where you essentially provide a container where someone can come and they can deal with whatever it is they're struggling with. Everybody's struggling with something different, but I think the container works for a bunch of different issues in the same way that it's like if you are a voracious, if you read a lot, you start to see that, almost every single hero's journey is exactly the same. You start to watch. I don't care how many Netflix shows you watch, but it's like eventually you start to see that there is a formula that us as humans are just drawn towards, which is it's like someone who's brave enough to make a change, goes through the change, comes up against some sort of a monster, has to deal with that monster, and that monster can be a literal monster, i.e., like via Game of Thrones or via Lord of the Rings, or it can be an internal monster. And be it your childhood, your relationship with your spouse, et cetera, et cetera. But we're all looking. Uh, the container in so many of our stories is it's like, okay, someone was brave enough to make a change, went through the change, survived the change, and then at the end of the day, there's some sort of a lesson for us. And I don't think that the wellness journey is any different than that. Whereas it's as long as you have some sort of a container that can prevent you from going like, oh, I know what the solution is. I'm just going to start doing heroin on Wednesdays, and hopefully that makes a positive impact on my life. But if you have some sort of a container, a relatively gentle guide who has figured out who has been able to answer some of their own questions. They don't need to be able to answer your questions, but as long as you can see that someone else asked questions and found answers, then it gives you a hell of a lot more courage to go out on your own and start to ask questions that at one point in time terrified you.